In recent years, cities around the world have been trying to find a way to use short-term rental housing as a tool for growth without negative side effects. That's one reason why the city of Boston recently placed new restrictions on home sharing, especially in properties owned by investors. New research from Northeastern University has found a correlation between that kind of housing and crime figures, but the disruptive quality of life problems that many would have expected were not exactly what they found. To explain the findings is one of the lead researchers, an associate professor of public policy and urban affairs, and director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, Dan O'Brien. Thank you very much for being with us, Dan.
Hey, my pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Dan, tell me a little bit about what you looked at in this study and how far back.
So, of course, we looked at Airbnb listings back to really the beginning of Airbnb listings. At least we tracked it back to 2008, although our crime data only starts in 2011. So we really looked at the relationship between kind of the emergence of those listings over time across neighborhoods throughout the city and patterns of crime kind of at the same time, but also looking at, if a certain amount of growth in Airbnb occurred in one year, how did that predict the amount of crime in the next year or even 2 years later over an 8-year period?
Now, in our news business, we've been hearing these nightmare scenarios that people in the neighborhoods have been projecting. They say, this is going to have result in rowdy parties late at night. There will be tourists, being mugged in the streets, or people will be drinking too much, and you'll have fist fights on the corner. Is that what you found?
So it's funny. I'm really glad you asked that question. That's exactly why we did the study, right? Hearing all of these public narratives on this front. And as scientists, we basically said to ourselves, well, we got to test this, right? We got to find out if these are just anecdotes, because a certain proportion of the population is always going to create a certain amount of rowdiness and so on and so forth. So is this just like the accident of the bad apple Airbnb moments, as it were, or is this a systematic thing? And what we found was that, yes, Airbnb predicts increases in crime, but not in the way that you think based on those anecdotes. So we looked at the number of tourists coming in through Airbnb, and that didn't predict anything. It didn't predict any of the three forms of crime we looked at. We looked at violent crime, we looked at social disorder, so things like parties, rowdiness, public drunkenness, so on and so forth. And we looked at private conflict, which is conflicts between, it includes domestic disputes, it includes landlord-tenant disputes, so on and so forth. And the second piece of evidence that kind of called those anecdotes, or whether those anecdotes becomes a systematic story, into question was that we didn't see any rise in the social disorder. We saw no rise consistently in the presence of parties, in the presence of public drunkenness, loitering, things of that nature. What we did find was that the number of listings, or really the number of buildings with a listing in a neighborhood, that predicted a gradual increase in violent crime over time, which implies that it's the presence of the listings themselves and the way they're interacting with the natural social dynamics of the community that's really the issue here. It's not the tourists who are coming to town.
When you say violence, what exactly are we talking about?
We're talking about a series of 911 report types that include things like fight, person with a knife, calls about guns, basically any sort of call that implies a direct encounter, a direct violent encounter between multiple individuals.
Now, of course, as you're well aware, Airbnb's take on this is that if there's a problem here, we're not the cause. And maybe your study doesn't exactly go into cause and effect. So what is the correlation?
Well, so to be clear, and this has come up in the coverage of this work a lot, and also the way people are handling it on Twitter, right? We actually used one of the strongest tools in the social sciences for establishing cause and effect. I don't want to bore the viewership with methodological minutia that many of them either never took or haven't had to take in a long time. But we use something called fixed effects models, which really does sort of isolate all sorts of other factors that might be responsible for changes. And we specifically looked at not a correlation between the presence of Airbnb and the presence of crime. We actually looked within a community when that community sees a rise in Airbnb, does it then also see a rise in crime at the same time or at a later time while controlling for a whole bunch of other factors and other changes that we put into the model? So now, obviously, every study has known unknowns, has unknown unknowns, right? Things that could be measured additionally, but we were quite rigorous in terms of testing causality here, and so I'm well aware of Airbnb's pushback on this. Uh, to put it in simple terms, they make some methodological pushbacks that are actually addressed in the paper. The critiques themselves are kind of disingenuous. And again, this is not to say that every scientific study doesn't have some limitations that need to be considered. Future replications are necessary. But Airbnb's response read a lot more like the same company that decided to do personal attacks on Michelle Wu when she wanted to design common sense regulations for Airbnb than it did in actual discourse on the quality of the science.
One thing I see here, not without some overlap, is that when you have this kind of housing use, you also have these other uses that attract investor owners because they bring in higher returns. It could be multiple students in what used to be a family apartment, or it could even be transitional housing. And if you get more of that in the neighborhood, that means you're going to have less of something else. Does less of something else also amount to one of the problems here?
And that's Chris, that's exactly the story, and I'm glad you bring it up. So, how do you understand Airbnb leading to more crime if it's not the tourists, right? How do you make sense of that? And there's this idea in criminology that's been around for a very long time, over a century, that communities that have a lot of transients, right, and have challenges developing relationships between neighbors, establishing norms, knowing what's expected around here. How do things work around here? And that then gives residents the trust and the faith and even the empowerment to take action on those norms and expectations. And so simple things like, you're at the park, can you watch my kids for 5 minutes while I run and go get something from my car? Or people are messing around or doing something unexpected, or say graffiti, vandalism or something. Do you have faith that someone in the neighborhood will come along and say, you should not be doing that, or take action, make a call to the police or something? And that's kind of the lifeblood of a functional community. And as transience goes up in all of these ways, right? One of the classic measurements of this is how long people have lived in their houses, and the proportion of homeowners in a neighborhood it is very predictive of this sort of what we call the social organization, right? And the ability of a community to manage local activity. And it's been shown to be able to prevent crime or lower crime levels locally. So these are kindred things, at least conceptually. Now, there is a major difference, though, and I want to be very careful with this, right? There's a major difference between saying that rentership or rapid turnover or student renters, so on and so forth, can have that type of effect in a neighborhood, but those are things that are necessarily part of our society, and so we just need to manage them properly, right? And provide the proper housing for low-income people who need to rent, right? That's something we need to deal with and we need to manage. That's a lot different than saying people coming in and out of a neighborhood every 3 to 7 days because they're on vacation is a societal need. And so they need to be considered in different ways, right? Our work should not be used to justify trying to push renters out of neighborhoods. It should be used to understand that these are the dynamics here. And that at the end of the day, Airbnb is the most transient form of resident possible. And that should be taken into consideration when, as you said at the top, considering the trade-offs of the positives and negatives of how many Airbnbs you really want in the neighborhood.
One more question. This is mainly about the timing of the study, which goes, I think, through 2018. And since that time, there have been these new regulations in Boston. But I went on the internet last night and I saw these ads for, furnished apartments with flexible leases. So do we have to be maybe more vigilant again, seeing if the same thing is sort of spreading again under a different name, perhaps?
It's possible, right? It's very possible, and something we should keep an eye on. And by the we, I mean now Mayor Janney and her team, right, and BPDA and Department of Neighborhood Development, right? They should be keeping an eye on these things, whether they're flying under the radar in some ways. Now, some of those things tend to be associated with, say, hospitals, right? There's a rider in the regulation for partnerships with hospitals because hospitals have a lot of kind of short-term employees who come in and out, especially traveling nurses and such. But one thing I would say about the regulations, right? The regulations in Boston, I think are a really good start because they're thoughtful. They don't say we should ban Airbnb outright, which I don't think is necessary. I think there are actually positives and benefits to Airbnb. But they do say we don't want an overabundance of Airbnb. We don't want our neighborhoods becoming informal hotels. But the whole point of the regulations is very much about the accountability and the oversight of the tourist's piece, right? You can only do it if the building is owner occupied, and you're only allowed to have one listing per building. And so that's very targeted around this idea that the tourists themselves, that activity is the problem. But now with this new information, we can design regulations that pay more attention to the mechanism that we've described in this paper, which is that you just don't want that many listings in a neighborhood. You don't want that many units in a neighborhood that are that transient. And with that perspective, maybe we need to be thinking about neighborhood quotas because, not that anyone's doing this necessarily, but you can imagine a neighborhood that's all 2-family, 3-family houses. There's a lot of neighborhoods like that in Greater Boston. And you could picture a situation where every one of those buildings has one listing, right? That's actually feasible. And now that's a thought experiment, not likely to happen, but it's a loophole and it's a weakness to the current regulation. And so I think that with this information on hand, the regulations that Boston has in place can be refined to be a little bit stronger and to really think about how do we maximize the benefits of Airbnb without letting them get too dominant in a neighborhood.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure, Chris. It's been great.
Dan O'Brien from Northeastern University. We'll have more news in just a moment.